Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to be reviewing Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. This is a book review that I've been putting off for some time, largely because, if you may have noticed, it is my highest rated book of all time. Specifically, I read the audiobook, but I have read the paperback copy, which is why I have the paperback copy, and also it is probably my favorite book and most recommended book, just generally speaking. If anyone is kind of remotely interested in developing their worldview or themselves as a thinker, I think that this book is essential because the topic that it covers is cognitive biases. Daniel Kahneman, his background is the field of psychology, but he won a Nobel Prize in economics, specifically for the work that he really details in this book, and that is studying the ways in which we, as humans, will consistently not behave in the way that economics would like to define us as rational actors, in ways we consistently deviate. And I think understanding this is really, really valuable. And so I quite like this book. We won't do kind of a comprehensive rundown on all of these, but to just kind of provide a little bit of context and examples, he starts off by creating this sort of fictional narrative of two types of thinking, which, fast and slow, but he calls them System 1 and System 2. And he also identifies them as fictional. It's just kind of a device for explaining the way in which we think. And System 1 is a fast-oriented thinker that is able to grasp information quickly, come to very, very quick conclusions, answer questions that have not even yet been asked that are related to kind of information at hand, and functionally just provides you with information very, very rapidly. And System 2 is more of our conscious type of thinker, what we would think of as our kind of rational agent type of thinker, and how we, generally speaking, like to perceive our own way of thinking. By and large, to the degree that System 1 makes errors, these are invisible to us, and not only that, often System 2, the rational portion of our brain, will be complicit in kind of covering up the follies or erroneous thinking of System 1. Often when prompted for a reason for coming to a conclusion that was reached kind of automatically and maybe not through good judgment, we will come up with an answer via kind of conscious thinking and believe that, even though it is not our actual reason. And so to provide a couple of examples for System 1 versus System 2 kind of distinction, one thing that humans are very likely to do is when presented with a difficult kind of question that you don't know how to answer, you will often substitute a different question for that difficult question. And so an example is, generally speaking, when evaluating politicians, we don't actually know that much about their platform, don't have kind of a running tally of what issues are important to us and where politicians lie in relation to those issues. And instead of asking which politician is more fitting on the issues to me, we ask the question, who do I like more? And an example of this bias, or one of the things that this is called, is the halo effect, which is we tend to treat people who are more attractive as being better in a lot of ways, more competent, more moral, this type of thing. But the substitute question, often it can be difficult to predict, for example, how well someone will do 10 years from now, and so we will substitute that sort of predictive analysis instead with a different question that is easier to answer, and we do this unconsciously. I think a study that is referenced in this is one in which people were supposed to answer based on a student that they had information on. I can't remember his GPA or reading level. They were supposed to predict how well they think that person would do in college. And a bias that they experience, or that would cause people to predict not very well, is a combination of intensity matching, which is one type of bias, and also kind of the phenomena which gets described repeatedly in the book, which is what you see is what all there is. And so if they were told that this person got really good grades, they would predict really, really good success in college, which at first blush seems reasonable. But what they would do is, if they had they would take the good grades measure, and then they would put it, you kind of internally automatically just do this thing where you put it on a scale of, let's say, 1 to 100. And then if you have a grade level of 100, what you then do is when you project how well they're going to do in the future, you just take that same sort of rating and you project it into the new scale. How well are they going to do in the future? And so someone who is doing like 100 on a reading level gets projected as doing 100 in college. And someone who has maybe 50 in reading level gets projected as being a 50 in college, which is to say there's an intensity match. And something that gets overlooked is a regression to the mean, which is if you're actually trying to predict how well people should do, reading level is not actually a one-to-one predictor of how well people do in college. If you sat down and you thought about it, you would realize that for any one person, what they're likely going to do is very close to average. And sure, reading level or GPA in elementary school might inform it a little bit, but it should only bump you a little bit off of average. But instead, what we do is we intensity match because it is easier to answer the question, how well are they doing now, especially if that's the only information you have, how well are they doing in elementary school, than it is to answer the question, how well they're doing in college. So you substitute the question, you match intensity in terms of the outcome, and you ignore something like people in general tend to have average performances because it's not a one-to-one predictor. You would be much better off predicting closer to average than intensity matching. So that is one example. Another kind of cognitive bias relatively late in the book, I think that the substitution and this type of stuff was a little bit early in the book, is a sort of framing bias and how different questions can be kind of posed to you in a different way, whether it's a positive or a negative, and this can lead to wildly different outcomes. And one example is doctors, when the information on how high a mortality rate of a procedure is framed as a survival rate versus a mortality rate, will be more likely to prescribe the procedure. So if a doctor is told that something has a 90% survival rate versus a 10% mortality rate, they will be much more likely to assign the procedure. And if you were a rational kind of thinker, how we like to think of ourselves as being purely information oriented, the framing of these two things should not make a difference. But what it is we are afraid of loss. If something is framed as a loss, we will be more likely to try and avoid it than when it is framed as a potential gain. And so surviving is framed as a potential gain, and mortality is framed as a potential loss. And so just the framing of this alone can warp our thinking and our preferences. And so I think that there are kind of a lot of ramifications of this down the road, which we're not going to unpack, but just consider if you are telling yourself or viewing stuff in your own perception when you make a decision as either a loss or a gain, your framing of it can make you either radically more willing to do the thing or less willing to do the thing, right? So if you frame something as you're going to lose out, or FOMO or this type of thing, you're going to be a lot less or a lot more averse to any type of risk, and averse in a way that is unreasonably so. Another example of this that's somewhat similar is organ donation, which is this is a similar kind of in the neighborhood type of bias, but people tend to look at acts of commission as being more substantive than acts of omission, and will default to the default if they don't want to have any sort of cognitive experience, or they don't want to make a decision. And so what they found is in areas with very similar cultures, if you have a opt-in system for organ donation is something like 15% in terms of people who opt in. But if it's opt-out only, which is to say that you are automatically an organ donor unless you check a box that opts out, something like 70 to 80% of people end up becoming organ donors, which implies that just the mere framing of how it is, how that information is hugely informing the question on something that's otherwise relatively straightforward. Incidentally, organ donation is kind of the cheapest form of philanthropy one can engage in, although usually when you die, your organs are not going to be usable anyways if they can't get you to a hospital in time. But these are some examples of some of the biases, and there is a whole ton of them. He goes through all of them in a way that is very, very information dense without sounding information dense. There are 38 chapters, and they all kind of go through various types of kind of incorrect ways of thinking, or ways in which our type 1 tends to make errors in thinking. And it's not to say that system 1 thinking is bad, because it does something incredible. It is really fast and it encapsulates a majority of our thinking, but it is prone to committing certain types of errors very, very consistently. And so, just to rattle off the names of a couple of chapters: The Law of Small Numbers, Anchors, The Science of Availability, Emotion, and Risk, Tom W.'s Specialty, Linda, Less is More. That's an interesting one too. But if we get into this too much, probably going to end up trying to rattle off all these studies. So rather than doing that, I think we'll just get into the ratings and try and have a little bit of a shorter review. I think that the main idea is kind of portrayed here. For utility, I gave it a 9.5. I think that this is specifically for people who care about the way that they think, but I also think everyone should try to kind of, to at least some extent, care about the way that they think. I think that if someone doesn't want to read a technical book, and they don't want to read a book that's nonfiction, something like this, that a much more accessible version of this is The Undoing Project, or a much more accessible way of being exposed to these ideas, because that is a narrative format. It specifically follows the life of Daniel Kahneman in a much more narrative structure while discussing a lot of these ideas, and I'd recommend that. And for something a little bit thinner, I'd recommend Predictably Irrational by Dan O'Reilly, which is like some 200 pages instead of 450 pages, or 400-ish pages, but I'd still recommend this. For novelty, I gave it a 10. I think that we don't get exposed often enough to biases that are common in human kind of evaluation, except for a couple, which kind of have reached more mainstream. And I think that being exposed to the ways in which you are likely to commit errors of thinking on a very consistent basis is something that is important. So we have two things, which is that the information, I think, is important, and also I think that it is relatively rare to come across a lot of these. Some of these come across, or some of these we see fairly often. I guess you see survivorship bias occasionally, you see halo effect somewhat consistently, but a lot of the things that are in here, like how the framing something as a negative versus a positive can have an enormous impact, this is relatively rare. And Daniel Kahneman, he writes very clearly, and he's also the one that did all of these studies. And so he both understands the information very, very well, and I think writes very well. For entertainment, I gave it a 7. I maybe find this more entertaining than the average person, so maybe for some people this won't be anywhere near as entertaining. For style, I gave it a 7.5. I think he does a really good job in terms of making the material really engaging, capturing kind of the essential element of the information, and also portraying the information in a way that is relatively concise. I understand that it's like 400-page book, but that's because he goes over a lot of different information. For readability, I gave it a 7.5. I think it's about as readable as you could get for being something that's kind of science-oriented, and for readability, it would have to be like something that is just less densely oriented information-wise to, I think, score higher. And for style, it's not like he's writing something that is supposed to be read for pleasure of reading these, like, prose or something like this, but I think he does a really good job on both of these fronts. For interest, I gave it a 9.5. I generally don't score 10 on anything. The novelty on this is the only thing I've scored a 10. I might kind of regret it. In theory, I think that 10s shouldn't be possible, or they should be very, very rare. But I also think that this is... I also think I should maybe open that up a little bit, because if you're not assigning 10s ever, then that's maybe a little bit of a leak in one's rating system. But this is also the first 10 I've given out. So as far as interesting goes, I think it's... I think in a lot of ways we tend to be our most interesting subject or topic. And so when we read about the way that we think, I think that tends to, even though it is talking about a bunch of studies in psychology, tends to be pretty information, or pretty interesting information. So, and this gives it an overall score of an 8.5. I think the highest rating I've given before this was an 8, and that was like an 8 with an asterisk. I don't think anything is scored above, up above an 8, with the exception of one book that was compilation of 100 great essays, and all those essays are really great. And so this kind of weird book to rank, so that was kind of put up with an asterisk. I may be mildly concerned that I overrated this book, but broadly speaking, this is kind of my number one recommend. I would recommend actually getting a physical copy of the book instead of the audiobook. I know that my most recent kind of read was an audiobook, but there's stuff like visual diagrams and stuff, as well as like graphics, and this will be, difficult to see through audio only, which, my camera very performatively is interested in kind of maybe sussing that out. Camera just had to get a little cute with it. But I think that if I were to think of anyone who's kind of interested in anything that I make, in terms of videos, and I had to think, I have a hard time imagining that anyone who's interested in anything I have to say would not also be interested in this book, just generally speaking. And so I would put it as like kind of my most solidly recommended book, even though it is a relatively long book. Generally, I don't like to recommend long books because most people don't read in complete books. Again, for a more accessible version of the book, I would read The Undoing Project by Michael Lewis, who we've kind of put a couple books up from him recently. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, do the YouTube algorithm thing. And other than that, have a good one.